If you're an author or plan to be one, get excited because this podcast is for you. Book Marketing Mentors is the only podcast dedicated to helping you successfully market and sell your book. If you're ready for empowering conversations with successful marketing mavens, then grab a coffee or tea and listen in to your host, international best-selling author Susan Friedman.
Welcome to Book Marketing Mentors, the weekly podcast where you learn proven strategies, tools, ideas, and tips from the masters. Every week, I introduce you to a marketing master who will share their expertise to help you market and sell more books. Have you ever thought that your digital marketing might actually be hurting you? Because if you're not breaking through the noise, then you're probably adding to it. Maybe your social media presence isn't making you look like an expert. Well, today's special guest has a refreshingly new view on all of this. Tom Schwab, Chief Evangelist Officer at Interview Valet, wants you to consider that you're just one conversation away, because that's been his experience and he has the data to prove it, working with over 250 leading authors at Interview Valet. Tom believes that you are just one conversation away if you want a rich life and a profitable business. Well, Tom, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the show, and thank you for being this week's guest expert and mentor.
Susan, I am thrilled to be here and excited to have this conversation. Appreciate you letting the world listen in.
Yes, it is. I love this format. This is my all-favorite format. Tom, you've worked with hundreds of authors to use targeted podcast interviews as a powerful marketing strategy for virtual book tours. And your mantra seems to be one conversation away. So let's dig in and tell us more about what exactly you mean by that.
In marketing, there's a phrase that keeps getting used, one funnel away. And it's a great marketing ploy. And I'm all for automation. But in my experience, the best things in life have not come through a funnel. I think the more discerning people are, the less open they are to a funnel. The person that's going to be the promoter of the book, that person that's going to be the Uber fan to buy other ones, they're probably not going to be moved because they, saw a dance on TikTok or a quick ad on paid social media. They probably want to know who the author is. They want to know what the story is behind it. What's the burning desire? At the end of the day, they want to know, like, and trust you. And I think it's really, really hard to do that on the noise of social media. And we've seen over the last 9 years that getting out on targeted podcast interviews, talking to your ideal readers and your ideal listeners, because often people will just listen to Audible books. It's a great way for them to try before they buy, to focus on different areas of the book and just entice them enough so that they want to come back and either read the book or recommend the book to someone else.
Yes. I mean, isn't that what we all want with our books? Is that you rightly say that somebody says, hey, you've got to read this book. It's the best thing since sliced bread. So yes. Tom, we're talking about virtual book tours, and you're using targeted podcasts as that strategy so that our listeners really understand what exactly is a virtual book tour. I mean, this phrase has been bandied around. I just want everybody to understand so that we can really focus then on that podcast aspect.
Yeah. The old book tour, it's very similar to that, right? Go to a place where your audience is. Have them come there to learn about you. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of great bookstores around anymore. And even if there are, not everyone has the time to go there for the book launch that time, that day. So a podcast book tour or a virtual book tour is a way that you can go to audiences that are already there, already looking for new books in your genre, and be able to talk about it, be able to launch it. And one of the neat things about it is that it's not time sensitive. You can time shift it. So what often we see people doing with virtual book tours is they'll do a lot of the recorded ones maybe 3 months before the book comes out and say to the host, hey, my book is going to launch at this date. Could you, release it plus or minus a week? That allows them to front end load the work, the conversations, and then it frees them up for other things that might be more live, which could be virtual, right? Could be talking at different summits or different live events, or even doing things like live television. But the podcasts, by and large, are recorded, so you can get those done early. We've even had some clients that have done them while the book is in the final publishing. Because if you're an author, you know exactly what the book is about. You can speak about it before the editing is even done. And it's a way for them to get out there. And some of them have said they've liked the practice almost of going out on podcasts to talk about their book so that they could get the message down. They could get confidence there before it actually launched. And then they were doing in-person events.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point, because so often when authors come to me to publish their book, one of the first things I say to them, well, what's your book about? It's so challenging for them to be concise about what exactly the book is about. They may go on for 5 or 10 minutes, trying to explain every detail of the book. And I don't need to know that. I just need that overview or the message that the book is delivering. So I think this practice, and I know that that's something your team at Interview Valet works with you on, is to train you as to how to position yourself in your book on these targeted podcast interviews, which I'd like to go into now. And that's talking about targeting a podcast. How do we even look to find which are the right podcasts for us to be on?
And it's interesting. You had talked about being concise. What is your book about? I think the follow-up question to that is, who is your book for? It's not for everyone, right? The riches are in the niches. So trying to figure out who is going to be the super consumer, who's going to be the super advocate of this book. There may be a lot of people that are interested in it, but who are the ones that are going to be either the readers or the advocates? And let me give you an example of this. We're working with a lady that wrote a book about being a widow and getting beyond being a widow, right? So a lot of people could benefit from that book. But as we were talking about it, the people that want to read that book, widows, right? Are they just listening to widow podcasts? Probably not. So where would they be listening? And even more so, who would influence them? And we started to talk about different things. Would this be a great thing to get on a podcast with funeral directors and talk about, hey, this is a great book that could really help a lot of your people? Boy, if they started recommending that or giving that as a gift, could you do that to financial advisors? They may not be widows, but they may know widows, or even people that are in the hospice care or cancer. She calls them widows in waiting, trying to catch them where they are. We've also had that with some authors we've worked with that were targeting people that were going through pregnancy. That's a very small window. There's probably about maybe a 7-month window of time. So you've got to find them, because you don't want to be heard before they hear you, or if they say, I wish I would have known that about a year ago. And while not everyone is expecting, there's a lot of people that know someone that is. And so if they could be that referrer to the book, and on a podcast interview at the end to say, if you know someone that could benefit from knowing about this book, if you could tell them about this podcast interview, it would mean the world to me. Because while they may not invite them and bring them to a live event at a bookstore, it is so easy in order for someone to share a podcast interview with someone else, to say, Susan, I listened to this interview the other day and I thought of you. I thought you would enjoy it. The chances of that getting listened to is so much more powerful. And I think that's that virality that most people look for. Boy, if you can have people talking about your book and recommending it and referring it, that's better than any billboard or any paid advertisement.
Without any shadow of a doubt. I mean, word of mouth advertising is the thing in terms of recommendation, and especially if it comes from somebody who you know, a friend, a family member, even a colleague. I get recommendations all the time from people. And if it's from somebody I know, trust, respect, I'm going to listen to it, or I'm going to watch the interview or recording or whatever, or read the book. I was listening to one book yesterday. They recommended another book, and I was like, oh, I'm going straight and having a look. Where can I get this book? And it turns out, don't laugh at this, but I already had it in my library. So much for that.
That means it was a good recommendation, and you're probably like me, where it sounded familiar, it sounded interesting, and it's time to go back and either read it again or listen to it again.
And that's exactly what I did, or I'm in the process of. So yes, fabulous. Okay. Getting down to actually finding those podcasts. Now, you were speaking words that are music to my ears, the whole idea of riches and niches, because that was one of my international best-selling books. As our listeners know, I'm very much into this whole concept of niche marketing and going deep into, just like you had said, with these funeral directors and who else would be interested, and sort of places and people we don't often or automatically think about, but going that exercise of going down that route. Then it's a matter of finding those podcasts. And I know obviously that's a big service that you offer your clients. And if we were to go and look for ourselves, at least in the beginning, to get the ball started, how would we do that?
Yes, the data has gotten so much better, and we license dozens of databases, but some of the information is free online. Google is great. So if you wanted to say, what are some best podcasts that talk to business consultants, business coaches, whoever you think your target audience is, and start down that rabbit trail and say, are these my ideal podcasts? And I don't think you really need to get a list of thousands of podcasts. One of my big mantras this year is more is not better, better is better. Because if you can find the podcast and find a handful and reach out to them, do the interview, do a good job, podcasters know podcasters. And at the end of the interview, you can say, Susan, I enjoyed this so much. I love sharing about my book. Do you know any other shows where you think I could bring value? That is powerful. Because, if you just find 5 podcasts at the very beginning and they introduce you to other ones, you can get the old dance card filled up very, very quickly.
Yes. And I often get asked by other podcasters, well, who've you interviewed who you think might be a good match for my show? I'm referring people all the time. Yes, what you're saying is absolutely right on, because people know people. And you don't know who knows who unless you start asking those questions. So that's so important. Tom, something else that you mentioned earlier that I want to just go back, and you'd mentioned doing these interviews maybe 4 or 5 months or so out from the actual publication of the manuscript. That's something that so often I find that authors sort of don't take into consideration, that so much of the marketing needs to go on before the actual publication, and you've actually got it in your hands. So many authors feel that they actually have to have something in their hands, something tangible, before they can go out and market it. So you're saying 4 to 5 months out.
To start with that, yes, because I say the best podcasts are like doctors' offices and restaurants. If there's not a waiting list, there's a reason, and probably a reason that you don't want to be there. Even the mean time that our data shows, it's about 30 days from invitation to recording, and then about 42 days from recording to going live. So the best podcasts, if you reached out to them and said, Susan, I would love to be on the podcast. I've got a great book and it's coming out next week. Can you get me on? Probably not. And not everyone listens to the podcast the first day. 80% listen in the first 30 days. There's that wide period there. Sometimes I think of it more like print media than radio, right? If you're on radio, they invite you for next Tuesday, you get interviewed, it goes live, everybody hears it there. But print media is more where they have a content calendar and they're like, oh yeah, your book would tie in very well with our fall episode, or we could tie this into, I can think of one, International Women's Day. That's what this author talked about. And we were able to reach out, a few months beforehand and say, do you have, or what are your plans for your podcast for International Women's Day? And a lot of the podcasters responded with, when is that again? And we were able to tell them, here's the date. Here's the perfect person for that. Or tying something in the spring to talk about, here would be a great episode for Father's Day or Mother's Day, Veterans Day, trying to tie things in there. It's a powerful, powerful way to solve a podcast host's or the content producer's problem before they even know it is.
Yeah, that's so true. I love that approach. It's so funny that you said that and picked on International Women's Day, because my publisher, Wiley, of the Dummies book that I'd just recently released, they came to me literally, I think it was a week before International Women's Day, and said, would you give us a quote that we can put on social media as a female author? And I was like, okay, I think this idea just came up quite quickly in response to this, even though I'm assuming, know about this well in advance.
And there's multiple bites at the apple you can have. Peter Matabuzi wrote a great book called Now I Am Known, an amazing man that grew up in pretty much abject poverty in Africa, had everything against him, with a positive attitude and the grace of God and some help of people. Now he lives in the States. He's adopted children. He's a foster parent. And you want to talk about a great story, right? We can tie that into Mother's Day. We can tie it into Father's Day. We can tie it into National Foster Care Month, National Adoption Month. And so trying to get long tail out of that, not just when the book launched, but trying to keep that out there. There's all kinds of creative ways you can do that. And another one is if you find a book that is similar to yours. Say if I've got a negotiating book, it's similar to maybe Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, right? Love that book. You could say, oh, okay, what podcast has Chris been on? And if his audience was interested in that, that could also be a nice audience for you. So it's sort of a way to not only look for the podcast, but also look at it from the guests.
And that's also a dynamite strategy. In order to do that, you would just do a search on Google and say, hey, what podcasts has Chris Voss been on? Is that how you would do that?
Very much so. You could do that. A lot of podcasts now are video, right? And so you could even go to YouTube. And just put, Chris Voss interview. And I'm sure you'll find all kinds there.
Oh, that's brilliant. Brilliant. Listeners, we've got some dynamite strategies here. I hope you're taking this down. If not, a lot of it's going to be in the show notes as well. Tom, when somebody is invited or gets invited to be a guest on a podcast, it's not about talking about the book. This, I think, is a mistake that authors make, is that they feel that it's only talking about the book. If that's not what they're talking about, what would they necessarily be talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting that podcast interviews are a great way to get that know, like, and trust and curiosity. They are an awful place for infomercials. People don't like that. If you're just there to sell your book, it's not going to work well. The host won't have you on. They may not promote the episode. Heck, there's even the dirty little secret in podcasting is that sometimes files get lost, right? If you start selling too much, they don't want to expose their audience to that. The idea is, how can I be a guest? How can I give the most value? It could be the inspiration, my story, my challenges in writing the book. The other thing too is that if you spend 30 or 45 minutes trying to summarize the entire book. Well, why would anybody need to buy the book if you've just given them the summary? The other thing too is that if you try summarizing an entire book in 30 minutes, it's probably going to be just such an overview that it won't be interesting. I can think of one client we worked with, Jeff Madoff, wrote a book called Creative Careers. And so many people would look at the title and go, yeah, I don't have a career podcast. I'm not creative. Well, there was 13 chapters in there, and each one of them could have been a standalone book. So on some podcasts, he would go and say, let's just talk about the myth of the solo creative or the lone genius. And that would be the entire interview. Then they would reference that this is just one of the thoughts in his book, Creative Careers, and come back to learn more about the other ones. There'd be other ones, other podcasts that he would go on, and he would talk about entrepreneurship, and that entrepreneurship is art, that the creativity, the risk taking, putting things together, bringing a team together, how launching a play or a musical is like launching a software as a service company. So all of a sudden now he can go to technical podcasts. So trying to tie it in there. I remember years ago, somebody told me that content is king, but context is God, right? Small g, but you have to tie in what your book is about to what the audience is most interested in.
And that's really what's most important. I mean, I get pitched all the time by agencies. Would you have our guest on? They've just written a brand new book. And I'm like, I don't feature books per se on the podcast. I'm looking for marketing savvy. I'm looking for strategies that my listeners can use when they stop, listening to this episode. They can say, I can do this as something that a takeaway that they can use. So for agencies to know and understand that rather than try pitching me on someone who's just written a book is just pointless. They might as well save the effort.
And I would point out, listen to what Susan just said. That's expertise coming from a podcast host. I've always said that there's 3 types of people every podcast host wants to have on. And Susan, you can tell me if I'm right on this. They're friends of friends, and people they want to be their friends. Nowhere on there does it say a creepy, cold pitch.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I fall back if I need an episode. I've got, a cadre of people I can just call up or text, email and say, hey, would you be on my podcast? Let's talk about some different aspect of your business or something that would be helpful to our listeners. So yes, that absolutely. People I know or people who've been referred to me. I mean, I get a lot of referrals or ask for referrals as well. And then, of course, somebody who sounds interesting. Maybe I've heard them on a summit, or maybe I've heard them on somebody else's podcast and I think, wow, this person would be good fit. Or it's a subject that I've never touched on. I recently interviewed a couple of ladies on crowdfunding for authors. I'd never talked about that. Some guests had mentioned the idea of crowdfunding, but we've not spent a whole episode talking about it, which is exactly what we did with Victoria and Charmaine. And that episode will be coming out shortly, listeners. So watch out for that one. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's a bit of what do you call it? Nepotism in a nice way.
Sometimes I think of, forget the word podcast and just focus on the word guest, right? Who do you want to invite to be a guest? It's somebody that you already know, trust, would like to know a little bit more. And people will say, well, how do I get that if I don't know the host or the person? Gary Vaynerchuk has that book that's called Jab, 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 right hook. I missed a couple jabs in there, but I look at it as give, ask, right? So listen to the podcast, give a rating and review. Podcasters listen to that. Mention something on the social media, share it, give feedback, engage there, keep giving. And then when you reach out, you want to give. So I listened to the podcast. I enjoyed this part. I think I could offer your audience this insight on something that hasn't been talked about before. You give them that, you'll find that they start asking you to be on the podcast.
Fabulous. No, that's so important. I know that our listeners probably chomping at the bit to find out more about Interview Valet. How do they find out what they need to know? So take it away. Let us know that.
Yeah. Interview Valet is a white glove full service agency. Our mission is to personally introduce inspiring thought leaders to millions of people they could serve for the betterment of all. I remember telling my mom that, and she's like, what's that have to do about podcast interviews? And it's not podcast interviews. The goal is not just another podcast interview. It's about getting your book out there to the world, getting your ideas out there. You know, there's a reason that you wrote that. And there's some resources. If you're interested at all, just go back to interviewvalet with a v.com/BMM. So Book Marketing Mentor. And I'll put a few things there. One's a webinar that we did on how you can do podcast or virtual book tours. A lot of details in there. I also wrote a book called Podcast Guest Profits, How to Grow Your Business with a Targeted Interview Strategy. You can buy it on Amazon, or if you just go to that page, I'm happy to send you a free copy. And then finally, if you'd like to talk about how you could use podcast interviews to launch your book, to grow your business, to really help people, I'll put the calendar scheduling link there too. So all of that is back at interviewvalet.com/BMM.
Beautiful. And that's so generous. So thank you. So talk about give, give, give. You definitely ticked all those boxes. So thank you. Tom, you know that we always end our interviews with a golden nugget. So what would you like to leave our listeners with?
It's a phrase that's always been on my heart, probably since I got out of the Navy decades ago. And it's the fact that what's ordinary to you is amazing to others, right? What you know, what you have experienced, we all underestimate that. We all undervalue that. And it's like, well, everybody knows that. No, they don't, right? What's ordinary to you is amazing to other people. Most people don't share what they know. And if you have written a book, you've gone through the blood, sweat, and tears to share that what you know. And just never forget that getting out and talking about your book, talking about your experience, it's ordinary to you, but amazing to other people. So thank you for sharing what you know, and please continue to do that. And if we can help you do that on podcast interviews, it would be our honor.
No, I'm guilty of doing that. I know a lot of stuff and I forget that other people don't necessarily know what I know. So that reminder is brilliant. Thank you so much. And Tom, it's been amazing having you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And listeners, if your book isn't selling the way you wanted or expected to, let's you and I jump on a quick call together to brainstorm ways you can ramp up those sales, because you've invested a whole lot of time, money, and energy, and it's time you got the return you were hoping for. So go to brainstormwithsusan.com to schedule your free call. In the meantime, I hope this powerful interview sparks some ideas you can use to sell more books. So until next week, here's wishing you much book and author marketing success.